This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 564 of the Late Round Podcast, so many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. The NBA is back, and so is FanDuel's free over-under contest. It's simple. Just head over to FanDuel.com/over-under and choose either over or under for each listed prop. You can make free picks for a chance to win a share of $5,000. All you have to do is make your picks on FanDuel before every NBA on TNT broadcast for your shot at a big payday. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Today's a 15 transactions day. Let's get to it. Sell DeAndre Hopkins. Like any transaction that I talk about on this show, this one needs a caveat. No one is saying that DeAndre Hopkins is a bad fantasy football asset. No one is saying trade DeAndre Hopkins no matter what. What I am saying is test the market. To be honest with you guys, there aren't many wide receivers that I would want over DeAndre Hopkins from here on out. It's just that I don't think that Hopkins is in some untouchable tier like we get with Devontae Adams or Tyreek Hill. He's more so at the top of a tier with a group that's pretty big. So you might get a slight downgrade at wide receiver if you trade him, but it might be worth an upgrade elsewhere in your lineup. And let's just get this out of the way. DeAndre Hopkins is a wide receiver whose name has a lot of value because he's incredibly talented. He's one of the best wide receivers in the game. He might be the best wide receiver in the game. So you might be wondering, why am I sitting here saying to sell him? Well, unlike some of the other elite wide receivers in fantasy football, DeAndre Hopkins is not seeing that significant of an offensive share. He has a 20.5% target share in the Arizona offense this year. That ranks outside the top 30 at the position. Hopkins has failed to reach a 20% target share in half of his games this season. And yeah, he was a little bit banged up for some of that. But we're not getting typical DeAndre Hopkins this year. Hopkins has had 2 games this season with a target share below 15%. Across his entire career entering the season, he had just 13 of those types of games. When you remove his rookie season, that number drops to 3. That's 3 games with a sub 15% target share from 2014 through 2020. And he's already got 2 of them in 6 games in 2021. Hopkins is averaging 16.5 PPR points per game right now. He's just outside the top 12 at wide receiver. And I think that at this point, we have to probably just accept that this isn't some massive fluke. This is the way the Cardinals offense is operating. And given the team's record and given how well the offense is performing, why would we expect it to change? Again, I'm not saying that Hopkins is not someone that you want in fantasy football. It's just that he's now coming off a 2-touchdown game, and he now has been on the receiving end of 43% of Arizona's passing touchdowns. Since 2011, 10 wide receivers have finished a season with that type of receiving touchdown share. Of those 10 wide receivers, only 2 of them had target shares as low as Hopkins' share this season. So there could be some regression there. And given his name value and given the fact that he's coming off this big game, I don't think it's a bad idea to see what kind of return you can get for Hopkins right now. Don't trade him away just to trade him away because he's still going to be valuable. But his name obviously holds a lot of weight in the fantasy football world. Buy J.D. McKissic and add Jarrett Patterson. So I mentioned this on the 10 Trends show last week, but after week 1, everything was looking great for Antonio Gibson. He had a 23.8% target share in that week 1 matchup. Since then, Gibson's single game target share high has been 8.7%. He's averaging a 6.4% target share per game. For him to become a truly elite player in fantasy football, that needs to go up pretty dramatically. And I don't think that we're going to see that in 2021. He's been dealing with a shin injury. He's clearly not 100%. He was in and out of that game against Kansas City this past weekend. So I don't think Antonio Gibson taking on a bigger role makes a lot of sense right now. So enter J.D. McKissic and Jarrett Patterson. McKissick's someone who just doesn't get enough love for what he's done over the last year and a half, both in real football and fantasy football. We know that he was pretty viable last year, but even this season, he's become another high floor PPR option. He's finished as a top 15 running back in 3 of his last 5 games, and he's averaged a target share per game during that time of almost 15%. I don't think J.D. McKissic is going to be that tough to acquire, even with Antonio Gibson not being 100%. And he might even be on your waiver wire. J.D. McKissic is available in 58% of Yahoo leagues. But while all this is going on, don't forget about Jarrett Patterson either. He would benefit a lot if Antonio Gibson ends up actually missing some time. Because McKissic isn't really an early down back. He would take on some of that work from Antonio Gibson, but not all of the work. Now, Patterson's not the biggest running back in the world, but he did carry a big workload in college. And his BMI is not bad at all. He's sort of like a Devin Singletary type. So this week, I would go after Patterson in deeper leagues especially, and I would look to buy J.D. McKissic if you need a floor option at the running back position. Add Dearness Johnson and Demetric Felton. So Nick Chubb was sidelined in week 6. The only non-Kareem Hunt running back to get a carry in that game was Dearness Johnson. Johnson saw 1 carry and he got 1 target. And he played 12 snaps. The thing is, Kareem Hunt injured his calf in that game. He's now going to miss at least 3 weeks. That's according to Adam Schefter. So now the Browns' running back room is a complete disaster. And they've got a short week this week because they play on Thursday night. So because of that, Nick Chubb might not be able to play. And if he doesn't play, we're looking at Johnson likely as the 1A in this backfield. But don't sleep on Felton taking on a bigger role either. Felton's got a receiving background after playing wide receiver for 3 seasons at UCLA before converting to running back. And since Johnson isn't some established back, I think that Felton could steal some snaps in that backfield. Now do keep in mind that most of Felton's routes run this season have come while being lined up as a wide receiver. But he did run a couple of routes this past weekend from the backfield. That's according to Next Gen Stats. So if Hunt and Chubb are both out, it only makes sense to think that Felton's going to see more work in this backfield. I think Johnson's the one that you want to add most, but in PPR formats especially, Felton's kind of interesting. Hold Robbie Anderson. So it's been a tough year for Robbie Anderson. He was such a consistent fantasy football piece last season, but now this season he's averages 7.7 PPR points per game. He has a season high of 12.7 points. And that came all the way back in week 1. Now, I was a believer in selling Anderson after week 1. And the reason I'm saying that is because I don't want anyone thinking that I'm some sort of stan. That I'm saying to hold Robbie Anderson just because I really like Robbie Anderson. No, that's not what this is about. I'm just here to say that now is not the time to get rid of Anderson. Yes, he found the end zone against Minnesota in week 6, but it was a pretty brutal game. He had 3 receptions and 11 targets for 11 receiving yards. But look past that. Look past that stat line. Things have actually shifted in Anderson's favor of late. Across the first 3 games of the season, his target share per game average was just 10.8%. Over his last 3, that spiked to almost 26%. He just hasn't been able to convert those opportunities. And then all the while, Terrace Marshall was concussed against the Vikings on Sunday. That could help Anderson maintain a big workload in Carolina's offense this week. So the peripherals are there. Dropping a player with that type of target share, that's not something that I usually want to do. Buy Miles Sanders. So this is probably my favorite transaction of the week. When there's a generally accepted thought among the fantasy football masses, sometimes it's advantageous to just act against that. To just do the opposite. And I think a good example of that is with Miles Sanders. Fantasy football managers, everyone in fantasy football is very frustrated with Miles Sanders' usage. But things have not been as bad as you might think. Over the first 4 weeks of the season, Sanders was averaging a running back rush share per game of about 67%. He was seeing about 2/3 of the Eagles' running back rushes. Kenneth Gainwell was basically seeing the rest. Now, during that time frame, Sanders had a target share per game average of 10.4%. And this is where people were really frustrated because Kenneth Gainwell's was 12.8%. But over the last 2 weeks, things have gotten dramatically better for Miles Sanders. Seriously. I know his fantasy performances haven't been very good, but the peripherals have gotten a lot better. His running back rush share per game has gone from 67% across the first 4 weeks to 92.3% across the last 2. And his target share per game has jumped from 10.4% to 15.9%. Meanwhile, Kenneth Gainwell saw his running back rush share per game drop from 33% to 7.7%. And his target share per game has gone from 12.8% to 8.7%. That's across the first 4 games versus the last 2. And this is all correlated with an uptick in Miles Sanders' snap rate. From weeks 1 through 4, his highest snap share was 67%. Over his last 2 games, his low was 75%. A big reason that Miles Sanders hasn't produced in fantasy football is because of matchup. The Eagles have faced the Panthers and the Buccaneers over the last 2 weeks. Those are 2 of the better teams in fantasy football at stopping opposing running backs. things shouldn't be as tough for Philly's ground game moving forward. From now through the end of the fantasy season, so through week 17, according to my method of adjusting fantasy points, the Eagles have one of the best running back schedules in all of fantasy football. Only 2 of their opponents rank above average in adjusted points allowed to the running back position. Right now, at this moment, you shouldn't have to give up a whole lot to get Miles Sanders. He's not producing in fantasy football. Managers are frustrated. This is the perfect time to buy low. Add Rashad Bateman. So hopefully for a lot of you who listen to this podcast, you already had your opportunity to add Rashad Bateman because he was featured in week 4's version of this show. I also talked about him last week on the mailbag episode. But he made his debut in week 6. And in that debut, he saw over 22% of Baltimore's targets and he ran the second most routes at wide receiver behind Marquise Brown. Now there was no Sammy Watkins for Baltimore. But when he's back, Bateman's got the talent to continue this type of workload in this offense. And remember, it's not a pass-heavy offense, but it's a pass-heavier offense than what we've seen from Baltimore in recent seasons. Sell Latavius Murray. So speaking of the Baltimore Ravens offense, how about that backfield? It's an absolute freaking disaster. No Baltimore running back has seen a double-digit percentage target share since week 1. Latavius Murray, who's their lead back, he's averaged a running back rush share per game of 49.6%. He's averaging fewer than 1 target per contest. Now, he's seen more targets over the last couple of weeks, but his target share is still hovering that 7% range. So it's nothing special. It's nothing out of the ordinary. We all know this. Murray's getting by on touchdowns. He scored in 4 of 6 games this year. Despite this fact, he's not ranked in the top 20 in the position this season. Not in a single week, even though he's scoring all these touchdowns. And it's because his opportunity overall is not very good. There are teams in your fantasy league who need running backs, undoubtedly, especially during bye week hell. So it's not a bad idea to see if you can package Murray up with someone else to upgrade a starting lineup spot. Add Amon-Ra St. Brown. I don't really like the waiver wire this week, so you might have to dig a little bit deeper. And I think that Amon-Ra St. Brown does make sense. Over the last 3 weeks, he's averaged a target share per game of 21.8%. He's turned that into 7.7 targets per game. Now, he didn't run as many routes as teammate Khalif Raymond this past week, but from weeks 4 through 6, so over the last 3 games, he's only run 4 fewer routes than Raymond. And the 2 of them have run by far the most routes in that Detroit offense at wide receiver. And by the way, he also has more red zone looks over the last 3 weeks than all wide receivers and tight ends on the Detroit Lions. So he's worth a look this week. Add Rashad Penny. Chris Carson's now officially on IR, as we know, with that neck injury. And the Seattle backfield is sort of up for grabs. Now, I know in week 6 they featured Alex Collins. He didn't look that bad. And he's now seen back-to-back games with at least 75% of the team's running back rushes. But his 3.2% target share against Pittsburgh was not very good. And he's a little bit injured now too. So it's all pretty good timing for Rashad Penny to come back to this offense. He should be coming off IR this week. And without a ton of competition in that backfield, he should see some work. And look, guys, I know that Rashad Penny can't stay healthy, but he was a really good prospect. I think he's a pretty good player. So he's a worthwhile add off the waiver wire this week. Buy James Robinson. So a few weeks ago, I thought that James Robinson was more of a sell than a buy because of Urban Meyer's craziness in the way that he was utilizing Carlos Hyde in that backfield. Then before that Thursday night game against Cincinnati, Carlos Hyde was a surprise inactive. He had that shoulder injury. When that happened, I rescinded the transaction, and Robinson has not looked back since. Now let me say this before I go on, because I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for this transaction. The original process on being lower than the consensus on Robinson wasn't that strong. It was a mistake. I shouldn't have made the decision strictly because Urban Meyer's an idiot. Because Robinson as a talent never disappeared. That was never in question. He just had an ignorant coaching staff. He still has that. That staff could change though. And they did change. They changed the way they utilize James Robinson. And that has boosted James Robinson's fantasy value. So it's definitely the case of me forcing it a little bit. He should have been more of a hold than a sell back then. But I'm not going to sit here on my podcast and double down for the sake of doubling down. That's stupid. When I get new information, I change my mind. Just like when I saw Carlos Hyde was inactive against Cincinnati, I changed my mind. There's no chance I would have made James Robinson a sell had I known that Carlos Hyde wasn't going to play. When we get new information, it's totally fine to change our minds. That's at least the way that I approach things. Some people might hate that, but I think it's the way that you win. But I like James Robinson a lot right now. I like him more than the consensus does now. He's coming off of 3 really good performances where he's averaged a running back rush share of almost 90%. He had a 100% running back rush share in week 6. It's been far different than his 62% share across the first 3 weeks of the season. Now, his target share per game over his last 3 is only 7.3%. But he's basically been the sole back who's been running routes in that offense. More targets are going to come. Now, the reason I'm calling him out on today's show is twofold. Sometimes buying high is okay in fantasy football because not every manager assumes a player can maintain a certain level of production. And Robinson has scored a touchdown in each of his last 4 games. That's not something that we can absolutely bank on. But not every manager is looking further ahead than next week as well. Robinson has a bye this week. You can use that to your advantage when you're negotiating. And the good news is that after that bye, according to my adjusted fantasy points method, Jacksonville only has 2 bottom half matchups for running backs through the rest of the season. And here's the other thing. The only way for me to truly gauge what people might be thinking about Robinson from here on out is by looking at rest of season rankings around the internet, honestly. And Robinson, in a lot of those rankings, he's listed below players like Joe Mixon and DeAndre Swift. I think at this point in time, with the information that we've learned over the last few weeks, I would rather have James Robinson than those players. I'm telling you, that injury to Carlos Hyde really pushed the Jags coaching staff to be less idiotic. They're not being as stupid with their running back usage. And that's big, big news for James Robinson. We adjust with new information. Add Ramondre Stevenson. So I called out Ramondre Stevenson last week on this show. And I don't like repeating transactions very often, but I feel like I have to with Stevenson because something interesting happened in week 6. As we know, James White was injured in week 3. He's now done for the year. In that week 3 game, Brandon Bolden was the one who ended up running the most routes at running back for the Patriots. Damian Harris was in second. The following week, Harris ran 18 routes, Bolden ran 10. It was a pretty neutral game script against the Buccaneers. Then in week 5 against Houston, we saw Bolden run 17 routes, and Ramondre Stevenson was in second with 5. Now, part of that was because of Harris dealing with that ribs injury. But listen to this. This past week, things changed. According to Pro Football Focus, Ramondre Stevenson ran 1 more route than Brandon Bolden did. Damian Harris was 3rd in the pecking order. That turned into a 15% target share for Ramondre Stevenson. That was the highest target share that any New England running back has seen in a game since James White was healthy in week 2. I talked about this on the show a lot over the offseason, but Stevenson had a really underrated receiving profile coming out of college, despite his size. And we know that Brandon Bolden is not difficult competition. Could this be the start of Ramondre Stevenson having a more concrete role as a pass catcher for the Patriots? Like, could that be happening right now? I don't know for sure, but I don't want to risk my league mates scooping him up this week. Hold Allen Robinson. One of the most frequent questions that I've been asked since Sunday has been, can I drop Allen Robinson? Now, in shallow leagues, I don't think it's crazy to do. But here's the argument for holding on to Robinson. He's seen almost a 25% target share in Chicago's offense. That type of target share doesn't grow on trees. Now, I know that he hasn't done anything with that volume, and a 25% target share of a small pie is no different than like a 16% or 17% target share of a bigger pie. The thing is, Chicago's been fortunate to have seen some positive game scripts with Justin Fields as quarterback. During his first start against the Browns, everything was terrible. Everything was a disaster. So let's just pretend that that game never happened. In weeks 4 and 5 against Detroit and Las Vegas, though, the Bears didn't have to throw the ball a lot. So Robinson's 21.3% target share equaled 8 total targets. In week 6, Chicago trailed Green Bay. The Bears had a negative game script, and they had 25 team targets for the first time since week 1. This week, they get the Buccaneers. That's a team that's faced by far the highest pass rate in the league this season. Chicago's not going to be able to rely on their ground game against Tampa Bay. That could lead to a better day for Allen Robinson. So I would at least wait to see how he performs in week 7 before I drop him. Add T.Y. Hilton. So T.Y. Hilton returned to the field in week 6. He caught all 4 of his targets for 80 yards. His 22.2% target share was the highest on the Colts, despite running fewer routes than both Michael Pittman and Zach Pascal. He did exit the game with an injury, but it doesn't seem like that it's that serious. But do keep an eye on that. But during a tough waiver wire week, Hilton does make some sense to see if he has any magic left. Add Tua Tagovailoa. So I think the top streamer this week is Tua. Not only did he look pretty good against the Jags this past Sunday, but he gets the Falcons this weekend, and they're the fourth most advantageous matchup for quarterbacks when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. Tua's rostered in just 17% of Yahoo leagues, so he should be available in most of yours if you're hurting for a quarterback this week. Add the New York Giants defense. The NFL schedule has a lot of bye weeks this week, so it's harder to find defensive streamers, but I do like the Giants. They get a Panthers offense this week that's been struggling. Carolina's allowed 4 sacks per game over their last 3, and Sam Darnold has thrown an average of 2 interceptions per game over this time. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, the over-under in this game is just 43.5 points too. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to buy Calvin Ridley. I mentioned this transaction a couple of weeks ago on the show, but since then, Ridley hasn't played a single snap. He missed their week 5 game, and then they had a bye this past week. But the reason I'm bringing him up is because he's seeing so much volume in this offense, and he's a very good player, and you can't always find buy low candidates like this. Ridley has a target share per game rate of 27%. He's seen 8, 10, 11, and 13 targets this year. He's only found the end zone once, though. That's bound to change given the volume that he's seeing in this offense. Now, I don't want to just reiterate the things that I said a couple of weeks ago on the show, but sometimes a transaction needs to be repeated so you guys know where I stand on players. And considering the Miami secondary is banged up and that's who Atlanta faces this week, you may not have another opportunity to buy Calvin Ridley this year. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow.